Okay, fantastic. So Novuyo, like I said, it's not your first time with us. Last time we met, we had the privilege to discuss House of Stone with you. And now here we are with your new work, which is super exciting, Digging Stars, which we have spent the last month reading. Very excited.
Wow.
For everybody who didn't know, Novio actually facilitated for us some donations for this book. So it was really excellent to get those. And it took a while to get them to Zim, but we got them there. And so it's helped for everybody to get a copy and to read. So thanks for doing that for us.
It's a
All
pleasure.
right. So we typically start with a reading from you, from the author. So if you could open our session with a reading from the book and why you chose that passage. Yeah, so take it away. Oh, sorry,
Fantastic.
I'm Rumbi, by the way. I'm so sorry. I'm Rumbi Sinyemba. And Sandy and I co-lead the book club.
No, that's great. I mean, I can see all your names on
Fantastic.
the corner there, so that helps.
Fantastic. Um, sorry, folks, just make sure you are muted. Let me just before we start. Sorry. I think I got everyone. Okay, fantastic.
Fantastic. First, it's a pleasure. It's an honor to be here. It's really extra special for this book to be read in Zimbabwe by Zimbabweans. Distribution, publication is always an issue. So this is really a big deal for me. Both my books always have trouble, I guess, finding publication on the continent, but in Zimbabwe. But I do know that Weaver Press closed down recently, which was sad. So yeah, so thank you. So I'm going to read an excerpt. This is from early on in the book. This is page 49. And this is when the father, Frank, is laying out his philosophical treatise for Bantu geometries, okay? My father finally shared his paper on Bantu geometries one morning during breakfast. I studied the pages in his hands, slighted by their lightness. I'd expected them to be more substantial. He had worked on them throughout my stay, the foolish man, shooing me out of his office as though I were an Anopheles mosquito. He gazed at us across the kitchen island, his face illumined by a slab of sun spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows and across the set of floors behind him. He grinned and looked down at the pages in his hand, and then cleared his throat and read, Bantu geometries against Euclidean austerity, or the world is a poem. I can't think in straight lines. Wow, said Candice. You were right. The science board was never going to publish that. Wow, I said, not to be outdone by Candice. Next to me, Peralta grunted and continued thumbing his game console. My father began his paper by sharing the memory of communing with the digging stars as a child, tracking their trajectory across the sky with the help of the lone marula tree on the flat savanna horizon. He never tired of observing the cosmic dance between the digging stars and the Umtala, the stars shadowing the crescent arc of the sugar-crusted galaxy like children trailing their mother. Those nights spent stargazing were a lesson in patience, in the art of attunement. He felt a deep, satisfactory accomplishment in learning to read the smallest deviation in the sky's movements, noting the fine-tuned corresponding screech of the cicadas or the anomalous flurry of the bats. He knew when it was time to prepare the fields for the planting season just by looking up at the night sky and listening during the day to the stringent tweets of the Kalahari robin, and by sniffing the ambrosial scent of the red marula flowers. What was time but a river sparkling across a lapis lazuli sky, sucking you into its bottomless currents, so that you felt at once infinite and infinitesimal? To know a constellation, then, was to face not only one's immensity and one's insignificance, it was to know the vista that participated in its membering. It was to befriend the creatures that swirled in its cosmic dance. It was to know its story. This knowing had been so intuitive to my father that he had taken it for granted as a child until he got the scholarship to the Catholic mission school and it was beaten out of him with books also, and Euclid. And she's reading, bless her. She's present. Yes, with books and Euclid's straight lines and Father Pius Schambach. He was enthralled by the empiricism of the ancient Greek astronomers. Time no longer ebbed and flowed like a river, but became discrete and linear. He found he could chart his day without paying heed to the stars or the moon's voyage across the skies or the seasonal migration of the birds. Occasionally, while deep in the throes of some linear math problem of Euclidean geometry, he would be startled by the piquant smell of gardenias invading his nostrils, or the rust-colored hills thrusting their nipples into the sky's blue mouth in the distance. And then the moment would dissipate, and the world would become again a thing merely filled with other things. I'll stop there. Thank you. So I chose this passage because this is where Frank delineates the philosophy, right? What Bantu geometries is. And he is in the process of trying to translate that into mathematics, right? I guess to modernize, right? He's inspired by Euclid, even though he's struggling intellectually against Euclidean geometry, right? To think about geometry that has time and place within where he grew up. And this is, you think of Frankie at the height of his career in the USA and feeling alienated from his community and trying to think, grapple actively with knowledge from back home. Yeah.
Thank you, Novuyo, and a great entry into the meat of what the book is about, which is going to be my first question to you. So take us as lay people. What are we talking about? We're talking about Bantu geometry. We're talking about Euclidean geometry. Is it important that your reader fully understands what you're talking about, or is there another message here that you're trying to tell us, using these as media? Yeah.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, we all did Euclidean geometry, I think in primary school and high school, right? I think we really get into it in high school. So all that math, we learned the right angle, the straight lines, the circle, the circumference of a circle. That's from Euclid. And so Euclid he was actually a mathematician living in ancient Greece. So he actually didn't create his own geometry, which was interesting to discover. What he did is he collated, he took all the thoughts and mathematical treatises in Greek at the time that was already being used by carpenters and people in everyday life. And he put that into a treatise, a theory. So he distilled what was already being used in the society at the time. And so this is where Frank is inspired by that. He is trying to take, and this is, I guess, an ambitious project, to distill the Bantu people, and these would be people of sub-Saharan Africa, not just Shona and Ndebele. That's why I used Bantu as a term. And his ambition is to distill that into a treatise, right? Which is the practices of the people in a certain region, right? Writing down what it means in its very essence, and then trying to mathematize it, really. And this for me really is about, when you look at the history of Western science, it went through a lot of exploration, a lot of experimentation, a lot of mistakes, and at great cost to a lot of us who were colonized, right? And for me, in this book, it's less important that Frank is right, but more important that he's experimenting, right? He's actively engaging with his environment, testing, and trying to come up with new and fresh ideas to engage with that environment. I mean, astronomy here is, you can think of it as a metaphor that goes throughout. Metaphors. Astronomy is science, astronomy is spiritual, which is our connection to the night sky. We only have to look up at any night sky. Astronomy is also history, something that all cultures have used, including our people. Isilimela, right? Digging stars were used by our people, Shona and Ndebele across different ethnicities to tell the time of day, to know when to plant, festivals, to understand what is going on Earth, right? Using the movement of stars to understand the seasons, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I like that it's spiritual, that it's history. And I think we see it in the book. There's a moment where the students, the different, like Shaniqua and Peralta, everyone brings their culture or their history to the table and to talk about the different names they had for the digging stars and the different names they had for, what they're seeing in space, which is pretty incredible. I guess my question is, we read a lot of African literature. Like it's why we're here, it's why we exist, it's why we've been here for 6 years. This is not your typical topic, which is why I love it, right? Because you reach a point where you pick up a book from the continent and you can almost predict what it's going to be about. But I had no clue picking this up. I didn't know what digging stars are. I didn't know, like, there was nothing to sort of tell me this is what you're getting into. And it took a while for me to understand what you were doing in the book. So I was wondering, I know people in the club were wondering, what is your connection to astronomy? Do you have some some training in it? Is it just something you're interested in? Did you do the research? Like, how did we arrive here?
I wish I had trained, in another life, I would be an astronomer, but, I came to it late in life. It started off as a hobby, really. I was curious about the stars since we evolved from them, or sort of a crisis of existence. Who am I? What am I? And this was more as a way to understand that big question: what happens after we die? That sort of was the starting question, a big philosophical question. And I was interested in a very technical sense, not just metaphor. What are we? And so that led me to astronomy. And I was just reading up actually on grief and fathers, which is, if you know, that's the emotional crux of the story, Athandwa's relationship with the father. Mm-hmm. And I stumbled upon this book by an astrophysicist, an American astrophysicist called Brian Greene. And so this is a book written for a general audience about his work. And he's trying to trace, when will the universe live on forever, or will it die at some point, right? Will it implode? And he talks about the death of his father as the starting point to understand this. And that was my entry point into astronomy, astrophysics. I just became, I guess, obsessed with it. It became a really personal passion. I read books on it. I started visiting observatories here in the US. So like at Harvard University, Boston, where I'm based, Wesley College nearby, they have these public nights where the public goes to their observatories. I'll go and ask questions, watch videos, read books. And then I was really trying to figure out, can I write a book about this? Because I was really deep into this work. And then I had read, there's an American writer called Richard Powers, right? And he's known as science, technology, and he has no training in that. It's just an interest. So I just told myself, I'll treat myself like a white man, and write whatever I want, go wherever, go wherever the passion leads. But initially in early drafts, this book really felt like science was white and Western, right? That's how we learn about science. And then I came across an indigenous scientist here in the US called Robin Wall-Kimmerer. And she's written a groundbreaking book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a botanist from the Potawatomi Nation here in the US, an indigenous nation. And so she's trained in Western science, but she grew up in her indigenous space. So she actually translates the two concepts. Let me tell you, when I was reading that book, it's also about disposition of land, history, and she's explaining the concepts, indigenous concepts, really clear, a light bulb. There were so many similarities with our history in Africa, our relationship to the land. And I thought, wait a minute, of course, all cultures, including our cultures in Zimbabwe, have a relationship to the sky. And that led me back to Southern Africa. And I was using Robin Wall-Kimmerer's concepts to think about our relationship to the stars, these stories that are like folklore. They were actually a map for our people on how to move, how to live, how to understand the stars. So I really went deep into that work.
That's astounding, Novuyo. It's so, as soon as you said, felt like a white man, right about anything. My question bounced back at me, like, did you have any training? Like, you had to have training, right? To write about this. That's an interest and doing the work and the research. That's incredible. And I think what stood out for me is, of course, these are things we know, that our peoples have always had a relationship to the moon and the sun and what's in the sky. But I didn't know that we had so much language for it. And that we had names, for the systems we were looking at, and for the things that were in the sky. And I know I'm Shona, but reading it in Nisindebele made me think, what are the Shona terms for some of these things? So how was it delving into the language for this for you? And how did you actually go about that?
It was challenging because a lot of our histories are oral, and the one sort of written text on Southern African star map, star skies, it's written in South Africa by this academic. I've forgotten his name. He's a white academic, and so you have to be careful for a lot of translation, like the meaning, what these terms mean. I spent a lot of time listening to the oral tales, the star sky. YouTube has been a great resource, and this was mostly from actually indigenous nations here I'm in Portugal right now, in America where I live. So a lot of reading, a lot of delving into history, picking up these star laws, looking for translations in like Ndebele, and then trying to using Robin Wall-Kimmerer's concepts, where she lays out, I guess, a concept for how indigeneity works, how indigenous science works, and using those concepts. It was a long process. And there's still a lot more work to be done. What's really exciting, we really don't know our history. What was really exciting for me was coming across, this is very nerdish stuff, sorry, but I wish we learned this at school, something called ethnomathematics. I'd never heard of ethnomathematics. Okay. By the scholar called Marsha Asher. She's an American scholar. And I remember getting goosebumps because she was talking about various societies across the world. And we're at this moment in time where, a lot of European concepts about the indigenous people was they're illogical, they lack abstract thoughts, right? All these very racist things. And now we're at a time where it's people or scholars are beginning to agree or realize that every culture, every people has a concept for abstract thought. So mathematical abstraction, right? It's in then all languages. And so what I like about Marsha Asher, she's very thorough. She will take a theoretical graph, like a mathematical graph theory, lay out the theory, then go into different indigenous spaces and explain how those abstractions work. So the thing with our cultures, unlike the West, was we didn't separate maths from poetry, from everyday life. It was forged. So you'd find two Bantu groups, the Bushong, this should be in Central Africa, the Bushong had this King's Festival where they'd draw these tiles and have this King's Dance, which if you translate it to the mathematical graph, it's like an abstract mathematical equation. And then the Chogwe, this should be, I think it's also central or closer to us in Southern Africa, the Chogwe, through riddles, through stories they tell, through games that they play, would also be having these abstract, she translated that to a mathematical equation that's developed so that was exciting for me. And so I'm really interested in that sort of thing. And so that's where the Bantu geometries came from.
Right. Wow. Really opened up another world for me that I certainly hadn't thought about before. So, Frank is the embodiment of this Bantu geometry, of this exploration of going back and finding the language. But he's a conflicted character because, of course, by the end, we realize that maybe he's not all good. And, I guess my question to you then is, why this trajectory for Frank? Given that part of this book, part of this project is to talk about, we do have our way of thinking and we do have our way of talking about the world. And then in the end, it's not used for good. Tell us a little bit about Frank's trajectory and what you're hoping we get out of his full arc as a character.
Good question. Because this book is set like 2018, so this would be a sort of a slightly alternative world, but actually our world. And so because this is what I'd call it's not really science fiction. It's I guess literature about science. If we had an astrophysicist right now from Zimbabwe doing work, where would they go? Right? What would they do? So there's this right now, the idea of if I say space exploration, space science, what comes to mind? America, right? The heart of empire with the resources and with the power to do this sort of scientific work, right? So there is that. And so Frank finds himself in a tough situation. When I say you have to love all your characters, including the bad guys, he's in a tough situation. He has this vision. He wants to build observatories in Africa and the Caribbean, but now there's the reality of how to do it. And I would say, I think maybe he gets frustrated at some point and he tries, maybe he's trying to be too smart. He just tries to take what's available to him. But it's interesting, this sense of the space, the university as a space and research is a thing that goes on in the US, right? A lot of research that's done, scientific research that's used by the military in the US and many other countries begins at the university level. So that's not even an unreasonable sort of assumption. I guess the new thing is that it's an African astronomer, right? So it would have been too easy for Frank to be this, good guy who gets our indigenous astronomy going and everything works out. There's also this problem of, Western science was also built on global science, on indigenous lands, indigenous knowledge. So also for me, what this book also wants to do is to resist the idea that Western science does not belong to all of us. Science or knowledge is for everyone to pick up and use however they want. Right.
Interesting. Okay. And then where does that leave our protagonist? So for those, I know there's a mix in our group. There's people who read early and fast and help summarize. There's those who read halfway, want to hear the author, and then there's those that want to read after. So I'm trying not to do too many spoilers, but our protagonist is Athandwa, who is Frank's daughter. And of course, she is just driven by everything her father has ever done, touched, read, breathed on. It's driving her. But of course, as you're writing that she's coming to this inevitable end where he's not all good. Tell us a bit about our protagonist, her story, her arc, what you're moving through the story, through this girl that we meet.
I mean, I know a few readers have, not here, but elsewhere, do not like Athandwa. But likability is it's neither here nor there in fiction. I feel like female characters are always under pressure to be likable and to be good. Athandwa, in early drafts before the indigeneity came in, Athandwa was chasing the American dream, right? That's really what it is that she's chasing. And that sort of thing is something I think in many of our African spaces we extol. So without indigeneity in this book, Athandwa was chasing the American dream. With indigeneity, she's dealing with empire and colonialism. That's what changes in the novel. But my basic thing is that Athandwa is colonized. We are Africans, we live in the post-colonial age, but our knowledge systems, school systems, we are colonized, right? And it felt unreasonable for her to take that huge leap, that external leap to change direction. But there is an internal change at the end. So for my thing is, I think of her as this precocious child, right? Precocious, who has this father figure as a mentor who then dies. And so she's left scattering. And then this is Zimbabwe around that era of the food shortages, which just heightens for me the sort of dysphoria, the dystopia. Right? So she's a typical African. She's hungry, she suffers from a sense of African exceptionalism, and she's out there to do what needs to be done. And you find a lot of tension in America between African diasporic communities and Black American communities. So that was also what the book also wanted to explore. Yeah. So for my Athandwa can be any of us. She's many of us, I'd say. But she also went to private school in Zimbabwe, so that probably muddies things, right? She has a lot of, but those, in Zimbabwe, we also extol private school education, right? There's this idea from Saladi, or if you have an English accent, or it's. I grew up in that era, in the early to mid 2000s, where that was extolled as you're smart, you're going places. So it is also she's an expression of the Zimbabwe she grows up in, which is colonized, despite the fact that we are post-colonial, or so we say.
Yeah, I chuckled at the girls' college descriptions because that was high school for us, right? Etiquette, and, how to speak properly like a lady, and all of that.
Oh my God!
And how it serves her nothing in the US, because of course the US is the opposite of that. So so. I'll tell you what I struggled with Athandwa a little bit, which is that it is 2000s. she is private school educated. I understand, the like what you're saying, the tension between Africans and Black Americans, having grown up in a Black majority country, you're not Black, you're just human. And then, you come across the pond and suddenly you're Black, and it's capital B Black. And it's like, what is all this?
Yes.
Um, she felt lost in it for too long for me. You know what I mean? Like, and I had to sort of remind myself, is this book taking place over like a semester, a year? I had to sort of think that through. Um, I wondered if this was part of your personal experience, maybe something you've seen. It was certainly mine, and I feel like I jumped into the Kool-Aid of the Black really 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 quick, and jumped in and started being all our hair or whatever, things that didn't matter to us
Yeah.
back at home, quite quick. But
Yes.
it's been stuck in it for a long time for me. Um,
Yes.
can we talk a little bit about that, and
Yes.
why it took almost a psycho,
Yes.
episode for her to sort of arrive at questioning her own knowledge? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's a great question. I think this is where the specificities of character, I think, which is what Athandwa is and what she's chasing, right? I always say if it's different to know theoretically, but it's different to know. Knowledge is something that's active, right? That you enact in the body. And if we all knew in that way of knowing, the world would be different, right? Because many people claim they know, but to know and to do are very two different things. So my thing here is this book takes place over the course of a semester. And I think Athandwa in Zimbabwe is really not interested in, I guess, in being Black, if I may say so. And this was for me, I guess, parodying girls' college, right? She's English is extolled. Speaking English with an accent is extolled. It's respected. And I went to girls' college, I'll say. So it was the sort of thing where, we'd go for debates, like debate competitions, and we'd go to say, hey, have I forgotten the schools? My God, it's been a while.
Petra
Yeah,
and
we
all
go.
those,
Yeah,
like,
Petra is also private. We go to a
yeah.
government school, and part of the intimidation was how we spoke. The idea that intelligence and accent are correlated, right? So that was the society that I grew up in. So Athandwa was really, there's nothing for me in Zimbabwe that is extolling knowledge, local knowledge, indigeneity, Blackness as a way out of anything. If anything, a way out of anything is this private school education, which is the reality for many Zimbabweans, right? So there is that. There's also, I think, her exposure to what she thinks America is, which came from something a friend of mine had said, that the problem with Africans is when we move to America, we always think of it as the white man's land. We never think of it as the indigenous people's land. And there's always a lot of some sort of jostling with African or Black Americans, because we're looking for exceptionalism, right? We believe this idea of working hard. And in working hard, we do attach ourselves to whiteness, right? So if you think America, no one thinks indigenous people. We don't even know that history. So there's that thing for me for Athandwa. I think beyond her being a victim, she makes a choice, right? What are the costs? What is the cost actually of knowing or being active in indigeneity and sort of African American history in the US, right? Her Shaniqua and Prowse, I think, are asking her to do something she finds difficult. I think she's too hungry and too ambitious, right? Which is to turn away from this dream she's always had to be like her father, also from exceptionalism, right? From the limelight, from power, right? Social and other sort of power, right? The sort of power that she has no access to in Zimbabwe. So that felt to me a bit true to what I think someone in Athandwa's position, coming from where she's coming from, might do.
Yeah, I think I felt that towards the end, when they're presented with the opportunity to do this internship. And of course, Peralta and Shaniqua can sort of scoff at it, and, but sure, you grew up with the opportunity, right? Like, why would you come all the way? I could hear like a mother's voice. Why would you come all the way to America just to laugh at opportunities, right? Like, you gotta take it no matter what you find when you get there. So
Yes.
Yeah. So just to pause a little bit, I know a lot of people have joined along the way. So welcome everybody. We are with Novuyo, who is a friend of the book club. We are exploring topics you wouldn't think you would read about from a Zimbabwean novelist, but here we are. We're talking about geometry and ways of systems of thinking that are indigenous to indigenous groups across the world, right? If you have questions, please gather your questions. If you want to type them out, you can type them out. But I'm going to stop talking at some point, and hand over to everybody to ask a question. So please feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions. So um, okay, let's talk a little bit about fatherhood. So it's funny every time Mother's Day and Father's Day come around in the book club, we sort of think, what are our favorite mothers in the literature? What are our favorite fathers? And lots of mothers, lots of great mothers who are self-sacrificing and lay down their lives, and all of that. And we hit Father's Day, and it's like, yo, guys, the fathers are a struggle, right?
Yes.
And fatherhood is a big theme here, which I love. I love from a female author, right? That fatherhood is a big theme here. So we've got fatherhood through Frank and Athandwa, but we have it through Frank and Peralta as well. And then the little love affair that, you know, feels a little incestuous to me, but okay. Between Peralta and Athandwa. But we also have
Yes.
this Mr. C character who also appears and sort of plays a sort of godfather role. So talk to us about fatherhood in this book. And yeah, what we can take from it, what you're hoping we engage with on that theme.
Wow. Yeah, Athandwa and Frank. I think it's really difficult with Frank. I think Frank would represent that sort of generation, should be my father's generation, who grew up during the, our civil war, and then post-independence, and then opportunities open up, right? And it's this idea that with your father, it's much easier to leave your child in search of that, other than if you are a woman, a mother, the choices, right? And this, I don't know. With Frank, I don't know that he would have stayed. The price for staying is never having achieved what he achieved. And so I guess this question is, what is a father, and what can a father bring to a daughter? And I don't know if the book answers that enough, right? Frank represents for Athandwa a possibility where she comes to associate her mother with stagnation, which is Zimbabwe, but her mother is the parent who stayed, right? Her mother is also the parent she got to see as a full human being, right? There's this idealization because Frank was never there, right? So you can see Athandwa never got to see her father as a person. During his weaknesses, during his, right, he's just this idealized, larger than life figure. And for me, Candace becomes also the epitome of just how difficult it is just to be a woman also trying to excel in the world. Frank and Peralta, this idea of incest, I mean, in the novel, there's a lot that happens emotionally, but, Frank only lives with Peralta for 1 year. So that's key there. And one thing I was really interested in playing with was the idea of possibility, what could have been, which is this idea of constantly mourning Frank and idealizing the life that could have been, but also what is, which is that Frank is not there. Frank never married Candace. I don't know what readers feel like. I just think, Peralta and Athandwa are not siblings in any way.
No, is this the first time you've read this?
There's the shadow of that. But that moment when they get together, for me, it really also had to do with that's the moment that happens. And afterwards, it's the first time in the book that Athandwa says, I felt really happy and I felt safe. So there's also, for me, something deeper going on there. And I know there's some Freudian discomfort there, which would be interesting to I guess, to think about, right? But if for being nitpicky, I say, for someone to be considered your kin in our culture, lobola, introduction to the family, to the ancestors. So there's that tension of, I think maybe there's that also that, because the emotional arc is always layered on Frank being here, but the actual reality is that Frank
there. Yeah. I guess, I mean, I wonder if it's the first time you've heard that incestuous comment. And
nope.
incestuous is too far.
I haven't.
Okay. It's probably too far. But I guess for me, when I was reading them coming together and them entering a sexual relationship, while at the same time they're both exploring what her father passed down to both of them while he was playing father to both. I think the fact that those two things lived side by side, the only reason Peralta has the spacesuit, has access to the papers, has all of that, is because for that moment in time, Frank was playing father figure to him. And it sounds like he might be the only one of his mother's lovers that he felt that with, right? While and he was physically there for that 1 year, right? So he's almost a little bit more real to Frank than his actual daughter, who, like you said, has all these wondrous ideas and has blown up this image of her dad, who wasn't. So for me, it's the fact that these two things live side by side that make it a bit hard to not think of them as spiritual siblings, at least. You know what I mean?
That is.
And then, here they are jumping in bed together, which is great. So
that is fair. I mean, that is fair. That is actually fair. I guess this is where, for me, fiction becomes that playground where we are with both the external, we are with the acceptable, but also the internal, which is what it is, which is it could be that Athandwa and Peralta cross a line. But I think that depends on sort of what the reader takes. But my question then becomes why, right? Why? What's going on with Athandwa, and what's going on with that attraction? I know she only knew Peralta for like 2 weeks anyway, and never spoke to him until now. And it could be that they're connecting because of their father. But there are these books here in the US, and these series where you have the young man who's brought up, the poor young man brought up by the rich father falls in love with the daughter. So it's
It could be my Zimbabwean conservatism coming to the fore there.
A couple of readers have been upset by that relationship.
It's interesting, but you know what? When you opened, you talked about the thing that's hanging over this book is spiritual, right? And it's the stars, it's the sky, it's diving into that. And the fact that their relationship blossoms out of when they decide to dive into the Bantu geometries paper, and they sort of entered that world. For me, then it makes sense. You've entered this other world, right? And in that world, there's just possibility, and it's a romantic world. It's out there. It's bigger than us, right? And in that sense, I could make sense of the two of them in there. I have to say, when she meets Shaniqua, who's also an interesting character, I wondered for a second if they were going to veer into something more than the sisterhood they then kind of firmly land in. And I wondered if that was just my brain, or if you were playing with female relationships as well, with Shaniqua.
Yes, I mean, interesting question. With Shaniqua, I was really interested in, I guess, female friendships more than anything romantic. And I think this would probably be because the theme of the book really is a romanticization of the father figure, I guess, of the male figure. And so I was really interested in Shaniqua's sort of sister figure, but a friend. So that's yes. A romantic relationship between Shaniqua and Athandwa in this book, I think, would take the book in a very complicated direction, away from sort of just the themes.
But there is something almost romantic, if you take a wider sense of the word romantic, about their sisterhood, and about they're very intimate. There's a lot of between the hair braiding, between them hand holding, and not in a scandalous way, but there is a really deep intimacy between the two of them, which is really beautiful to me. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I'd say it's an intimacy that comes from misrecognition on both sides, right? If you notice when Shaniqua meets Athandwa, there's um, this romanticization of Africa that, of course, Athandwa, as Msala, the private educated girl, cannot meet, right? It's this, so Shaniqua is very excited to meet Athandwa because for her, it's that connection to the continent. And from Athandwa's side, it's a lack of understanding or recognition of indigenous history, indigenous America, right? And so that alienation from the Africa Shaniqua projects, and also just dumbfounded about native histories. So for me, they try to connect from a place of misrecognition and then trying to eventually recognize or understand one another.
That's beautiful.
And that's not easy. I think that's part of the diaspora wars here in America between Africans and Black Americans.
Yeah. John, go ahead. Okay, John, yes. If you're talking, you're in mute.
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, Novuyo. Greetings. I'm sorry to say I didn't actually get the book yet, but I'm following the conversation on some of this. I was quoted 800 Rand here in South Africa for a bookshop to order it. So I was not able to get to that. Okay, I just have two kind of questions. One is the relationship of Athandwa with her father. In some ways, is he in her firmament a star? Was that one of your kind of perceptions, that in a way he was a star, even if it was in certain senses a star that fell? And the second question, just connecting to this, it seems to be easier to practice decoloniality if you're in the North, in the West, than in Africa. I mean, were you consciously, intentionally contributing to a decoloniality type of discourse? Was it intentional? Because that's a separate thing entirely from the astronomy. And connected to that, how much were you able to find, for example, Dogon or Kushite, other African experiences of astronomy, the Dogon seeing Sirius 2000 years ago and other things like that? Were those part of your firmament when you were looking at the other ways of seeing, if you like, the universe? Incidentally, when I started studies, one of my options was astrophysics, but I did not go into it. Okay, thank you.
I should have waited one John before you ask those questions, but well done.
Those are great questions, John. Thank you. I mean, the idea of the father as a star and a fallen star is a beautiful metaphor for the whole novel. Whatever we may say, Frank was exceptional, right? He's what's I've forgotten his name. Who is the MDCT? Who was studying? What did he study in the US and then came? He's just an exceptional, the sort of brilliant mind that goes overseas and gets these opportunities, right?
Professor Athandwa.
Yeah,
Professor of robotics.
Yeah. There's Athandwa, there's another one. See, so we have these figures in Zimbabwe, these mostly male figures. And so Frank is representative of that, of brilliance, lacking opportunity in a post-colonial space, and he's picked up. And that's what Western spaces do shamelessly, right? They take the best talent anywhere and they nurture it. Okay, so there's that. And of course, maybe there's this idea of precocious daughters struggling, right? Because then the father figure becomes a mirror, whereas the mother figure becomes a window maybe into a more domestic life, which may not be, which may not be amenable to young women who are trying to excel. There's that tragedy there. But of course, when we meet Frank in the US, there's Candace, who's equally brilliant, but is not able to ascend as much for whatever reasons. Motherhood, also, she's more ethical. Frank is working with space colonizers here in America. He is willing to do what it takes, though in his mind, he's trying to do it for the greater good. So yes, I came across different astronomical histories, including the Dogon, the Sirius star. One thing I was interested in was pairing what I call an indigenous worldview with what we'd call a Western scientific worldview. This idea of one thing that's really great about science, many people think science is an arrogant pursuit, is actually one of the most humble, which is science is revolution, that there is no shame in not knowing. That's Western science, right? If you do not know, admit you do not know, right? Then that's the starting point of asking questions, close observations, experimentation, right? Hypothesis. Then either you're proved right or you're proved wrong and you keep trying again. That's the progress. So I was really sort of interested in capturing that and bringing that with indigenous astronomy. And my big thing in looking at the histories of astronomy, as all culture, any society that takes itself seriously should be able to do away with concepts that are outdated and no longer serve it, and pick up new concepts. So that was for me one of the concepts. I was not interested in revering indigeneity in all its forms. I was trying to think of indigeneity in a modern form in today's world. What can we take when there's a lot we can take? What is outdated? And what can we take from Western science and fuse? That's sort of Frank's power. And that's the power, I think, of colonized people. It is easier to decolonize in America, in the West, than on the continent, simply because, as I said, the continent, we are still colonized. We don't know it or we don't think it, but we very much are. Zimbabwe, from the judiciary to our school system, it's still very, very English, very British. We take pride in that. It's difficult to break away from that because if you look at the history, our languages, the written Ndebele, written Shona, were created by our colonizers. They literally, and in that process of creation, something I'm reading about now, so interesting, they changed what our languages did or how they worked. They literally rewrote our histories. You know, when we say Shona and Ndebele, we think it's timeless, right? I was shocked to learn from Titi Dangaremba, Shona was not a tribe, Ndebele was not a tribe before colonialism, right? We had a different way of interacting. So it's so difficult to break away from that. The modern African is so tied to the colonial mission, to the Christian mission, to the civilizing mission. We are really more conservative than we think we are. It's a journey. But what I was interested in terms of America is this idea when different cultures come together. If coming from the continent and you're here in America and you interact with indigenous, Afro-indigenous, Black people, what is possible? But it's also important to be humble, to understand. And so this idea of this idealized future indigeneity, where we're all coming from. Athandwa is coming from a background that's really how many of us here know about the history of Native America, the specificities, right? What do we know about the US beyond, right? Many of us do not know much. We celebrate July 4th in the US, right? Native nations don't celebrate July 4th. There's just a lot there that makes it complicated.
Do you see spaces of decoloniality existing, blossoming in Zimbabwe? And I guess from John's question and thinking back to the book, the questioning and everything takes place in the US, and we sort of don't see what it could look like in Zimbabwe. It almost feels like it froze in time when she goes away.
Yes.
Could there be spaces like that exist? Could our literature pick it up? What are your thoughts?
That's a question I should ask you guys. I left Zimbabwe in 2009 for school in South Africa, and then 2013 I left to the US. So I think I should be humble enough to ask, what are the decolonial spaces in Zimbabwe today? The reason this takes place in the US, simply heart of empire, height of knowledge, right? In any era, empire is where cutting edge knowledge takes place, right? This is the epic. This is where Athandwa arrives and thinks I've made it, only to discover, no, I haven't made it. There's still, whereas when she's in Zimbabwe, which is many of us who can leave, it's like, I can always leave, right? There's America, there's UK, there's always a better place. So for me, that's why it takes place in America rather than in Zimbabwe, right? It's also a matter of resources. But But you got what are the decolonial spaces in Zimbabwe? Maybe that's something you guys can tell us about. What's possible?
This is a decolonial space.
Yes. Right here.
That is excellent. I mean, the word decolonization has also been abused in many places in Zimbabwe, outside of Zimbabwe. I think I'm against the reactionary decolonization, which is this purity of knowledge, which is never true. This idea that I'm Shona, I'm Ndebele, I have a pure Shona knowledge, pure Ndebele knowledge. Human migration across the centuries denied, right? It's to our detriment to reject, to say this is Western knowledge. The key to any society is to take knowledge that's useful and use it. What's difficult with us is that we don't know our own history, so we take all knowledge as all useful knowledge or modern knowledge is just belonging to the West, and we are backward, which came with colonization.
There's a question in the chat from Jonathan. What is the relationship between unrequited longing and identity in the characters in Digging Stars?
Oh, that's a big one.
Unrequited
longing and identity. That's a very big one. For Athandwa, of course, there's the father figure. There's a desire for a relationship with her father that she's robbed of twice. First, when she visits him, and there's a family. Candice and Peralta, Athandwa and her mother, right? They're the mirror, right? So there's this feeling of rejection that she internalizes. Of course, this had to do with the fact that, when Frank left, Frank promised Ma Athandwa, love, people go, people change. There is, I think Candice as there's tension between Candice and Athandwa. The thing is, as the author, I don't know all the answers. I inhabit the characters, write the story, and then the insights are always collaborative between readers and stuff. But with Athandwa and Candice, there's tension that has to do, again, something Freudian with the daughter and the mother. Candice as this mother figure whose Athandwa rejects, love interest. But there's also that rejection of Athandwa by Candice, if you remember, when she was trying to get out of Zimbabwe and she was, emailing Candice and Candice ignored her. There's that rejection. But fathers are everywhere in this book. Shamiko and her own father, who she does not know. Peralta and his own father. And, this generation of brilliant men, are they good fathers? There's also something there. What does it mean to be a father? Yeah.
Jonathan, is there more to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that the book's about longing for the stars, longing to do something bigger than oneself, right? To strive. And I was thinking that many of the characters, their identity is getting, I guess, blended into the melting pot of America. It's creating a tension for many of the characters between their Zimbabwean identities and their American identities. And that because of that, there's a longing for some sense of self that's not there in characters, as well as a longing for intellectual satisfaction.
Wow, that's powerful. I think that the hardest thing our own kind of spaces are, homes in Zimbabwe, maybe they don't provide is that the intellectual satisfaction. But again, this goes back to, and when we say colonial here, it's not even about blaming who or what. It's us as being the products of this time that happened globally and trying to figure out how to move forward. So if you look at the pre-colonial societies or the freer societies, those societies, we had our own concepts, we had our own relationship with, right, our environment and the stars. So we're able to use that knowledge powerfully in our environments. With colonialism, we lost the power to act on our own environments, which is where we are now. When you think of, if I look at the future in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe space station or Zimbabwe's relationship to astronomy, to the fruits of science, we somehow were lost, right? We've lost that power where we used our own local knowledges. In the modern sense, hybrid knowledges. So this book is really a question about starting point, right? Ngugi speaks about this when he talks about languages, that his dream really was for Africans, like all societies, we must start with ourselves, right? We start with where we are, then we deal with other society. We are not peripheral, other societies are peripheral to us. We start with where we are, then we go and look at Britain and these other places, and we engage with their knowledge from that central space. But the colonial experience, as we all know, is I'm peripheral. That's how we grow up. I'm peripheral is the center. And then that's the problem. So when you engage with knowledge, it's as though you have displaced yourself and you want to become the center. That means you also displace your knowledge, you displace your language, right? You're trying to, it's really a search for future, right? That relationship with knowledge, that usually in a decolonized society and pre-colonization came from you being the center and not being displaced. Okay.
That ties in with Dawn's question in the chat, which is, how do we decolonize in a colonial language?
Yeah, I was gonna say I have a question, but I couldn't find the hand gesture thing. So maybe when you're done with the other question.
I think Dawn's was more of a comment, just as we're talking about decoloniality, how do we even do that in a colonial language when we consume our own stories in a colonial language, right?
Yeah. That one is a hard one, right? The utopian, I think at some point the idea was Swahili should become like the cosmopolitan language in Africa. There are all these ideas. In terms of digging stars, this is a realist rather than like science fiction futuristic novel. It's if I'm starting from here, the one advantage that Athandwa would have is I'm from Zimbabwe, I speak English, I moved to America, I'm now able to communicate with Shaniqua, who's Afro-Choctaw, English, Peralta, all these colonized spaces, these previously colonized and currently colonized spaces. This English is what will unite us or enable us to communicate. There's for me, that's the reality of where we are now as we move forward. But, the other alternative is really to take seriously this idea of language work. In our countries, it also have to do with going back to the archives. In Zimbabwe, we don't really learn this outside of, I guess, specialized spaces. How was written Shona, written Ndebele, how were those created? I think it's so important to understand how we were created so that we understand exactly how to unravel those elements, right? You can't separate our education from mission education, which is why Christianity is like this. People say Christianity is un-African. It's one of the most African things in modern Africa. If you read the history, there is no modernization without Christianity on the continent. The mission schools were central in that, right? So I think that's part of the work. It's not even to start from, let's start with languages, let's start with history, and let's start with that colonial encounter. Let's go into the archives. Let's stop this thing of talking about Shona and Ndebele as though they're timeless identities. Let's historicize so that we understand,
I like how you deal with time when you're talking about these concepts, because you just said Christianity is the most African thing in modern Africa. It's the first time I've heard anyone say that, because the knee-jerk reaction is to say, no, it's un-African because we're stuck in this who we were. And that is the center of identity. But who have we been for the last, hundreds of years, right? Also matters.
It matters. And I know Titi Tangarma gave a talk at Emerson, my college, and she's doing an excellent, exciting project, like a pre-colonial book. And when you go into the archives, I've just been going in because I was trying to just understand this history. Pre-colonial history is also really exciting. It's not static. If you see Lobongula came and, he was conquering different people, including here in modern day Zimbabwe, there was a lot of maneuvering. There's a lot of political, the Maori religion, and the way it was also maneuvering pieces, co-opted, negotiating. It's an exciting history. Then you see how nuanced, how complicated, and how also human Africans are, right? The moment we start to romanticize that history instead of looking, like before colonization, things were fine. No, but before colonization, things were different, but they were complicated and interesting. and worthy of research. They were also not what the missionaries said. If you read the missionary archive, there's a lot of misreading, and there's a lot of really ugly racial stuff. But one of the beautiful things about those archives, which because the missionaries, we had the oral language, and when we're colonized, we lost that lineage of passing things down. It's still passed down, but more in the rurals. Because they wrote in real time, so you get this lovely moment where they're describing a woman living amongst the Mwari, a priestess, so they're describing one of the queens, and it's like, oh, you're getting this in real time, this description of how that world was. So that's what they're useful for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You had a question. Sorry, who was it?
Oh yeah, Kiwe.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is mostly on like maybe the process. Like when you're setting out to write a book like this, right? It's like, are you intentional about some of the things that come out of it? Because I know you're interacting with astronomy most of the time, like you were saying in the beginning, right? But the things that you find out is like you're talking about how like Euclid was like distilling things that were already in society. So when you were setting out to write your book, are you trying to make a statement that we can do the same, or maybe like say like you're talking about how like what's this? Science is knowledge is for everybody, or some things like that, or how the book becomes more spiritual. And also maybe on the context of decoloniality too, which is to say, are you trying to like there's a point where you kind of like addressing like colonial norms or post-colonial norms are already there in the book, right? Like even like the conversation we're having is centered around that, like Athandwa being from like a fancy school in like Zimbabwe, but then at that time she realizes her blackness and stuff like that. Like, are you setting out like intentionally to make those statements, or maybe to be more extreme to say, are you trying to make a political statement? Because you know how they say, like, you know how they say arts, you know how they say arts can be political, if not political already, you know? So is it like, kind of like saying, because the conversations eventually center around like decoloniality is now we are here. So is it something that you're like, I'm trying to make that a thing, or it's just so happens within like maybe the minuscule conceptualization of the book? Yeah.
Good question. I mean, the art is political. Also those more subtle politics. So I'd say if I wanted to make a statement, a polemic statement, I'd write an essay. So I would say with this book, it's for me, I start with a question. So with House of Stone, it was, why is Zimbabwe the way it is? So go back into history. This was astronomy, science makes me feel transcendental when I look up at the stars, right? And I'm interested in understanding that history. And what happened was when I put Athandwa, I put Shaniqua, Peralta, Mosi, people who are non-white, because a lot of these science books, Richard Powell, they're full of white characters, and white characters are usually, they de-ethnicize them in this fiction. So for me, it was simply what changed the book was putting these characters from different backgrounds into a room and having them interact. Right? Suddenly things are different. I found I couldn't write Athandwa interacting with an indigenous person in America without having those questions of indigeneity and history, right? They become impossible. And that was my lesson that, I cannot write like Richard Powers because my characters are not white. The moment they're not white, they're bringing their histories into the room, right? You cannot just walk into a room without that history. But one great thing that happened was that Rick, who's white in the novel, also became historicized. Rick is white in the book, but his whiteness is not background. It's not universal. Suddenly he has a history. And so for me, it was a discovery. It's more fun with fiction for me to start with a question. It also sort of hopefully gets closer to the characters. Beyond that, Athandwa, for me being colonized, if we get close to her, for me, it's more really about why does she behave the way she does? What has made her as she is, right? When we get close, I think maybe interesting things happen. For instance, if we think of, girls' college, we always think of it across college, and we laugh like, oh, those etiquette lessons. We were being colonized, right? That's an experience. That's a colonial experience, and that for me goes back to this notion that we are still colonized. We do not realize it, but we are still colonized. But what does it mean to be colonized? Beyond the distance we bring, where we're judging people, it's how do you deal with being colonized, but also in colonization is something intimate, right? Something that has made you, whose memories live in you, and then that you have to deal with, right? That's sort of the thing. And why it's also hard for Athandwa to give up those things. She's being asked, right? She's not being asked to decolonize as in that very distant. It's intimate. It's not easy to do. Otherwise, we would have done it, right? So there's also that idea of colonization as intimate rather than just political in a distant sense. And the hardest colonization is one that's inside, right?
We are over time, as we always end up being. There's a question here that wraps things up nicely for me. This is such a different project from House of Stone, in so many ways.
Multigrain.
So I guess the question is, how do both these books exist in your head? Like, oh, sorry. Let me just.
I miss Cerelac. Yes.
That's Nyasha. I know it's Nyasha. Where's her voice? Yeah. What kind of brain do you have, Novuyo, where these two things can exist and can come forth? And where in the world are you headed after? Because really the world truly is your oyster.
Thank you. That's so kind of. I don't know where I'm headed. Just spend a lot of time deep in my head, I guess. Yeah, just very much in my head. Get obsessions, and then follow them. But to me, they're alive. They're real. The one, what's connecting these two books? When House of Stone came out, it was read as fiction, nonfiction, as history.
Mm-hmm.
And even here in the West, they'd read it, and Mugabe was always mentioned, which was annoying because he was mentioned more than the characters. But even the ending was read as it was a book that was read as being in conversation with the society. So that's the tradition. That's how I wrote Digging Stars. But Digging Stars, for me, that's what connects the books. And these two really complex first-person narrators, right? Where Zamani is called a sociopath, and he's given more grace. Athandwa is always termed unlikable, but who cares? In fiction, you don't go to fiction just to like characters. You go there. Think of what's her name? Nervous Conditions. I was not sorry when my brother died. Right? So likability is just it's. But this book was read in a strange way in America. Or readers read it strange. They read it like it's they talk about characters. And they just talk about the characters. They hardly talk about the racialization or ethnicization of the characters. Thomas Long is obviously based on Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, right? So this again for me is a very social novel. So even the endings, it is in conversation, right? Just as the Earth's future, the planet's future is uncertain, so is Athandwa and the future of this world uncertain, right? It's set in this time. The same way when people read House of Stone's ending, they're thinking of the society. So it was strange actually for this book to come out and see it read. And this for me was the politics. When you write books, African books, you're read very differently. Now this book is about America. There seems to be no engagement of these characters as people who live in the world. Though anyone living this time surely can read Thomas Long as. So that's for me the connection. They're social novels. They're meant to be read not close-ended, but open-ended. To read this and interact with the society around you. So that's how I think of the books. As for what's next,
who knows?
We'll see. Yeah.
It's funny you said Samani is given more grace. Samani has divided our club for years. And continues to come up time and again as one of those characters. I don't know. For me, he was so unreliable that I really didn't like him for what he did to me throughout that book, because he led me places I shouldn't have gone.
Yes.
Whereas, and now when you say they're connected in that way, I'm tempted to go back and think of Athandwa and what she's doing and who she is and whether I like her or not. I'm not sure yet. Where I stand with Athandwa. I guess it's unfair to ask you because you write and we engage, but are we meant to like Athandwa? Are we meant to?
No, I think like or dislike is irrelevant. For me, it's more interesting if the reader maybe understands. Do we understand why she does the things she does? And that's for me a challenge for the reader to get closer to Athandwa. This is where where it's uncomfortable in the book. For me, is where I would encourage a reader to stop and to figure out why, right? That for me in writing is always a mirror of something from the reader, right? What is repelling? What is uncomfortable? Why is she so annoying if she's annoying? Someone was calling her uppity and using her British ways. I'm like, can you not see that this person is colonized, right? There's that moment where she's sipping tea at home and judging her family. It's a sad moment. That's actually not a good moment, right? It's a moment of alienation from community, from place. And I think that's part of the novel, to excel. To excel as a modern African you have to be consciously alienate yourself from your knowledge and take on new knowledge. That's really part of the book. But likability is irrelevant. It's more why does she do the things she does?
I like that. Where she makes you uncomfortable, stop and think why. I think a lot about how to read. And I think that's part of what having this book club and us engaging with authors is how to improve the way we read. It's an art, right? And I would like authors, one of our thing why we engage authors all the time is to remind authors that we are also engaging in an art, and that's an interesting way to look at it. I'm going to end with a quote that stuck with me, which is just after Athandwa, Peralta, and Shaniqua have made the reservation connection, and they sort of sit in it, and it's just, you can feel the weight of it's a connection, but it's such a terrible connection, across the spaces that they have inhabited or come from. And the quote is, it's Athandwa, of course, speaking, and it's, I scrunched up my face. I didn't know what to do with all this knowing. And I sort of put down the book afterwards and had learned so much that I didn't know about astronomy, about indigenous ways of thinking, and felt that in my soul that what do I do with all this knowing? Where do we go from here? And I think you've given us a lot to think about, to read into how our languages became, to ask the questions about how we have talked about the world, described space, described time, described environment, described difficult concepts, how we've engaged with them as people over time. It's heavy, but you've opened a door for, I think, for me anyways. I don't speak for the group, but for me anyways. So thank you so much for that, Novuyo. Just a couple of minutes. If anybody has a comment or a question they just want to fire quickly at Novuyo before we wrap this up. Thandi, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. I know authors don't like to categorize their works, but would you say this is a YA novel or maybe YA friendly? I'm not sure, because I was a bit confused when I don't know if that's the word, when I was reading of how to conceptualize your style of writing in this one, because it is quite distinct from House of Stone. Not to say that as an author you can't, play around, but it's just something that I was wondering whilst I was reading.
Good question. I mean, the distinction has to do with that first person voice, right? When I was Zamani, I tried to embody Zamani, then follow the rhythms. Then when I'm Athandwa, I then try to embody Athandwa. YA friendly? That's a good question. I don't know, maybe parents might not like Peralta and Athandwa.
Yeah, the scene.
And be like, yeah, is this YA friendly? I don't know that it's YA friendly, but the nice thing with YA novels is many YA novels read by adults, right? Like but I didn't think of this as YA. I just thought of it as literary fiction. If you've read, what is her name?
Nnedi Okorafor, kind
Oh,
of.
not Nnedi. She's yeah. This book escapes me. I will think of it, unfortunately. Yeah. But I guess that's up to you. I'm happy for the reader to categorize this however they would.
Yeah, Athandwa, we've gone back and forth about this. When I read part 1, I thought maybe it was. That's where I was landing too. And then part 2, I think
it just changed.
yeah. Part 2 took it somewhere different for me. Yeah. Anybody else? A comment for Novuyo, a question, a shout out? Please go ahead. And I also want to hear from the dawns of this world who were waiting for this session before deciding whether to read. I always want to check, have we convinced you?
Thanks for throwing me under the bus, Rumbi.
You know,
I am going to read this book. I struggled to read this book only because I love Zamani. I am pro Zamani and I am a Zamani appreciator. I am starting a society. So I was having a big, I was having challenges connecting. I sort of gave up when Athandwa throws her tantrum and then she starts pinching Peralta. But I will go and I will read Digging Stars, only because you brought up Zamani. So thank you very much for that, because I would love to see Zamani again in the future. I'm not trying to restrict your creativity, but please, I have unfinished business with Zamani. Thank you.
I will. Thank you. It's good to meet. Many people do not like Zamani, so I love meeting someone who loves Zamani, because I love Zamani. Athandwa is just a very, very different from Zamani, right? But this also for me also had a question of female characters, the middle class character, and what we take seriously in fiction, right? But yeah, thank you, Zamani.
We now need an essay from you, Dawn, compare and contrast 25 marks, Athandwa and Zamani. Tafadzwa, you had your hand up. But
I'll accept that challenge, Ruby. By the end of the week, you'll have my essay.
Tafadzwa, your hand went up and then down. Do you still have your comments?
Yes, I do. Hi, Novuyo, how are you? I think I was one of the vanguard readers, the early readers of the book. We spent a lot of time in this discussion talking about the colonial mindset and decoloniality of Athandwa. But I think there's part that you touched on in the book is knowledge or academia's relationship with capitalism. I think that was another important one, because like you said, Frank is trying to bring his Bantu geometries to that academic space. But unfortunately, the thing is, the people who have the funding are who is pushing what we are studying and what we are putting out there. So that part where you're talking about how Candice is just as brilliant, but she's not given that platform. Also, there's the conversation where the two are having, and they're saying that the board would never accept this paper. And I think that's in reality where we find ourselves in that academic space, that we can be as brilliant as we want in whatever department, whatever topic of interest, but it's the Jeff Bezos of this world with their billions of dollars who then fund our research. So unfortunately, Frank had to cross over to that dark side, because if he was not then working with the military or whoever was trying to buy his lasers, his research wouldn't have gotten that funding. So unfortunately, that is where we do find ourselves. And then at the end, it comes full circle for me with Athandwa then saying, oh, I will join I forgot the name of the company, whatever his company name is, and change it from the inside. And I think those of us who've matured in certain fields, we know there's nothing like that. They will change you. You do not go in and change them. So I just wanted to comment on that I picked up as well on the relationship with capitalism and academia a lot. Thank you.
That is so powerful. Thank you, Tafa. You've summarized it better than I could have. And this is where the question is, who's to blame? You know, people are like, oh, Athandwa is making wrong decisions. Our countries disappoint us, you know, and our choices, right? This, we think of this as systematic. It's if you know, it would not have. There was an earlier ending where Athandwa ends up with the three. And I remember my editor said, this is nice, but it doesn't feel real. And I thought that is true. So if you think of Athandwa also as a metonym, a representation of her time, she's just a small cog, you know, she's 24. Can she be expected to change things? So it's really about the environment that has made her and the fact that our dreams on the continent, if we want to, you know, achieve them, it's we have no fun. There is no one to believe, to push. Our politicians are busy eating money and all of that nonsense.
I think there's a part where she also says whether she's involved or not, they're still going to dig up the moon, whether they like it or not. Whether you are an intern or you're not an intern, they're still going to dig up the moon. And that talks to that juggernaut of empire that she is a cog, a very small cog.
Yes, thank you. And this is exactly what this book is. I know readers are like, oh, we want decolonizing. It's a nice dream, but that's why this is realist fiction for me and not futuristic. I'm really just interested in how do we get from here to there, sort of thing. Thank you. Athandwa.
Francis, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I haven't finished reading the book. I'm still reading.
Sorry, Francis, we can't hear you clearly. Maybe if you could shout a little.
Oh, okay. I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Still very faint, but we can try. Yeah, go ahead. Now we lost you. I shouldn't have interrupted you. Sorry. Francis, do you want to type it in if you can? We have 3 minutes. Anybody else? There's lots of comments for you in the chat section as well, Novuyo. Francis, can you hear us now? Too bad. I think we lost him. Okay. Any last comments from anybody else? I think we got everybody.
Yes, I just want to say, yeah, so this book is lots of themes going from theme to theme. And I just have one question. Are we supposed to, now that she ends up at mercy, do we look back and say how much of Athandwa should we forgive because of the terrors, because of the mental state? You know, are we supposed to look back in retrospect and say, you know what, this is a girl who's been going through a lot, until that doctor, that Meredith Grey, started unraveling her? She appeared like she was all together, but maybe she wasn't.
I like that. I was meant to forgive her. No. I don't. That's interesting. It's like, you know, is the author now trying to manipulate me into liking this unlikable character? No, I don't think we're meant to forgive her. But what is she to be forgiven for? Yeah, like, it's just in jail. Saladi living out what they taught at girls' college, and you know, she's out there to get. If you know, after the book, she'll probably be an astrophysicist, make money, you know, colonize a few places with Americans, and go down in history as the first Zimbabwean astronomer and be a figure somewhere. I know I'm sounding very cynical. No, we don't have to forgive her. But the psych ward was simply an exploration of what was going on with those terrors, right?
When she ended up in the psych ward, I was reminded of oh gosh, what's Titi's character's name? Tambu in Mournable Body, and I was like, why do all characters end up in the psych ward? Like, what's
because Africans, we don't talk about these things, you know. We don't talk about you know, we don't talk. I don't know if we don't talk about mental health, right? We don't talk about it. It's a big thing here in the US. Yeah, that's why they end up in the psych ward, because society is not able to talk about these things.
Yeah.
No one feels empathy for mental issues because people are going through physical, social issues. People don't think it's serious. Ne? Yeah. And we think of mental illness as like the extreme. We don't think of it as that spectrum, right?
Right. Which is why they threw religion at it, and they threw all sorts at it instead of
Yes. I mean,
I think I can. Yeah. Go ahead.
My head.
Okay. Francis, are you back?
Yes. Can you hear me though?
Yeah, very clearly.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yes. Oh, I was texting, but it's really long. Okay, I'll jump to what I'm about to say. So this book, I'm not yet done reading it. But there's one thing there's a part that I was reading that I kind of enjoyed because it was totally new, something that I actually didn't know. When Athandwa when they go and look for the mushrooms, and there's the top melanin and mushroom. I don't know. That part was just like, oh, okay. I didn't know this. This is cool. And it's quite interesting having to learn such stuff from a novel. It's like so. But the first thing that I wanted to say about the book was, this Zamani thing. When I was reading it first, I was reading it with my self-created voice of Zamani narrating it, and it didn't work like totally. It was like it was off. Then I had to change and like, okay, let's exercise Zamani for now, and like take this whole thing out and like read it from a fresh perspective. That worked, right? And I think for me, that's what I liked about the two books, really, House of Stone, and only because I've read a couple like maybe two books from the same author, and there's always the same voice can be used for both books to like narrate them for a couple number of them. But this one is like totally different. I think reaching that part where you're like, okay, yeah, no, I that on its own, I think really is what struck me about the two books that you've, like, I guess, I'm not sure if they're the two books that you've written, but yes, I think that of like two totally different narrators that can never be books that can never be read the same way. I think I really loved that.
Thank you, Francis. I mean, Zamani is story. So Zamani is such a very specific voice that it would be hard to. How does one replicate him in a different, Maybe there'll be a sequel. Though I don't know what would happen after the ending. Whereas Athandwa is a very different person. So this is where, as an author, Zamani is fiction and Athandwa is semi-fiction. Athandwa is closer to me, of course. But I feel like, especially with African authors, it's because we're read sometimes as nonfiction, like as though everything we write is from our lives. So there's that expectation that the voice should be the same. All right, there's a lot of what me and Athandwa, but you won't know because it's fiction. This is not nonfiction. Right? So I just put things there for nonfiction. But thank you for that, Francis. Melanin is everywhere, right? It's in us. White people also have melanin. It's just less melanin, right? Red hair, melanin. It's in lizards. It's in space. So it's everywhere. So there's also something to think about when we think of the politics of melanin that Shanique was talking about, right? That it's being used in space, but melanated people on Earth and melanin on Earth is being exploited. Yeah.
Sally, and I think it might be our last one because we're really over now. Sally, go ahead. Sally, if you're talking, you're on mute. Nope.
Network. You connect.
Yeah, I think Sally's stuck. Sally, if you can hear us, please type while I just wrap up. Novuyo, I feel like Zamani might haunt you for the rest of your writing career.
I can see.
And I wonder
I'll bring him back.
I wonder if you saw that coming. But again, I go back to the art of reading, and part of it is how many times do we read the same author multiple times, and what does it mean for us, right? To be able to allow the author to be a different person and a different writer when they do another piece of work. So that's something that I think we will go back and interrogate for ourselves, because of course we will read whatever you write. So think of us when you write next time.
You guys are my hardest readers, but I love it because it's good to be challenged as an author, you know. And also this was an experiment, right? I wanted to write science as an African. It hasn't been done, so it really is whatever it is an experiment. I wanted to try and see what would happen. That's the truth.
That's awesome. Our aim is that when Zimbabwean authors are writing, there's a little voice in their head like, when I go to HBC, what will they ask me? That is my goal.
What's HBC?
Oh, Book
Club. Oh,
that is my goal in this space. I want to haunt Zimbabwean authors.
No, you guys are doing an amazing job. Thank you. Of course, I must say one of my pride for this book was when it was, the National Book Foundation here in the US. That award for science meant a lot.
Awesome.
I think just for the book and just trying to do this whole science thing. And of course, what someone expects when they open a book. I had some readers like, I want to learn more about indigeneity. And it's like, no, that's a colonial mindset. So I always think of novels as they're social, but this is a philosophical, which is it's questioning what it is to be human. It's not anthropological, meaning it's not here to teach people about a culture or people, which is very dangerous, I think, for fiction. Right, which is how a lot of African authors are read outside. It's not as though they're read as complicated people with complicated lives. They're read to mind them of what it means to be Shona, what it means to be Zimbabwean, and that's so unfair, I think, on African authors. Yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you for sharing your experiment with us. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. And yeah, we look forward to whatever comes next. And yeah, we'll be here to read.
It's been an honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for the group, you know what? Let me not lie. Tondi, do you know what we're reading next? Or I think we need to. I don't think we've announced. Sorry, it's just escaped my head.
Yes, we have. We've all of them. We'll share it again in the group and everything. But again, thank you for everyone for joining in as well to Novuyo. Our July to November reading list is up. You can find that on the website. And next month we are reading My Name is Mame by Jessica George. So for those of you on the book, we'll be sharing the details just now. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your Sunday evening, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. And the recording will be up for this meeting on our YouTube page. We'll share that as soon as we've uploaded it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Novuyo.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.